Hi, Austin. Welcome to the Soft Focus podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
I'm so excited to talk to you. I absolutely loved Barron's. I thought it was extremely insightful and full of amazing citations and information. And I just want to start with what inspired you to write that book?
Um, it was accumulation of things. It was honestly a bar conversation in Des Moines is what really triggered it, but it was a bigger thing than me grappling with what happened to Iowa in my lifetime. These systems didn't break and concentrate overnight. They happened slowly. And it was, you know, the big thing in the Midwest is the Wisconsin Dells in the summer. It's like the water park capital of America. And so that's where we would always vacation. So we would drive up these 2-lane roads all the time. And that's dairy country. It's hilly. It's really good for dairy cows. And we used to play games and you'd see cows everywhere. And then you just stop seeing them. You would smell them because they're in these massive confinements, but you don't see them. And you also just, these towns slowly died. That 2-lane road became a 4-lane road. It doesn't go through these towns. And back to that bar conversation, it was talking with someone in 2018 where I'd heard the largest local donor in Iowa was this hog farmer who does 5 million hogs a year. And so that's what got me going was how did one man come to do 5 million hogs? Because that is I want to understand how he amassed that power to understand how he got to this point.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think about I'm from Baltimore, Maryland originally.
Oh
And
yeah,
now
Baltimore.
I live on the border of Idaho and Wyoming. And I can just as you were speaking, I could see all the whole space between Wyoming and Maryland just changing over the last 35 years of my life. And so many of those small towns getting hollowed out, and what the downstream impacts of that are, the poverty, the, mental health crisis, the opioid crisis, all these things because of the loss of livelihoods and vibrancy, and tying that all back to our heritage as Americans, as farmers, and kind of what's happened to that is an interesting story that I think a lot of people, I don't want to say aren't interested in, but they aren't aware that there's a story there. Now rural people are kind of cast aside in the conversation, or there's a certain part of our culture that wants to cast rural people aside.
As you were saying that, I kept thinking is we've just seen the collapse of the middle class family farmer and just the middle class everything, especially in these rural communities. And it's the middle class family farmer that pays taxes and send their kids to school versus an industrial dairy hog baron. A lot of these people live in Florida. My dairy baron lives at the Ritz-Carlton in Puerto Rico. They're trying to avoid taxes. They're not sending kids to school. I don't think people really outside certain areas really appreciate rural America is bearing the brunt of this system because, they're paying the most for the food. That was the fascinating thing when Kroger tried to buy Albertson. They admitted under oath, the executives, they have dominant market positions in rural communities for grocery stores and they gouge, which we shouldn't be shocked. That's what concentrated markets do. And on top of it, rural America is producing, quote, the most food it's ever produced, but none of that wealth is staying there. So it's
Yeah.
like an extraction almost.
I've heard you in other interviews kind of talk about this myth of efficiency and how the argument for allowing these mergers. I know you're also an antitrust expert, so feel free to hop in if my terminology isn't quite right. But when these mergers are happening, the excuse or the justification rather is always that it will make things cheaper, it will be more efficient. Can you explain why the cult of efficiency isn't all that it's cracked up to be?
Yeah, I kind of think of it almost like Goldilocks. like
Mhm.
I just realized as you get older, life is kind of like Goldilocks. You got to figure out a balance of things. And sure, there is some consolidation. There are some efficiencies. You can get something. It's not entirely always a bad thing, but things can go too far. And I think this is a really good example of things going too far. I'm trying to think of a merger off the top of my head. I don't know why I keep thinking about Sprint T-Mobile. Because we had 4 cell phone companies and now we have 3. I don't need a PhD in economics. No, we are being you're not paying a fair price when markets consolidate. And it's such a simple thing that's kind of forgotten, but the goal of any corporate executive is monopoly. That's where profits are. So they're always pushing towards that. And this cult of efficiency, the whole merger anti-monopoly framework in America, it used to be really centered in avoiding consolidations of power. It really tried to prevent companies from buying each other because no company buys another company for pro-competitive reasons. But then with the election of President Reagan, that framework really collapsed. And so this new framework comes in where if you can show that prices go down for consumers, so if I can show cell phones get cheaper, if Sprint buys T-Mobile, the merger can go through. Well, you can find an economist to give you those numbers. But on top of it, I think especially in agriculture, so let me say that ushers in massive consolidation because it basically justifies every merger. But in agriculture, there's so much more to farming and so much more to food production than what you can see in Excel. I think that's what's really been lost. I mean, I notice it the most with dairy farmers. I think dairy farmers have some of the most intimate relationships with their animals. Like every dairy cow's like like they know it's like a dog to them. They know the personality, they know the lineage, and Excel can't capture that. And also, what Excel can't do is it can't capture taste. And like this system makes bad tasting food, and like especially meat and dairy production inputs matter, and like a cow in pasture is just going to make such a better butter or milk than a cow in a metal shed in New Mexico.
Yeah, I love hearing what you're saying because I find that to be I do find it to come out in the quality of the product, whether I'm buying milk from some of my friends who do dairy or whether we're dealing with the hogs that we raise here. I know this is a very hippie notion, but the low stress lifestyle when an animal is raised by people who honestly care about them and have a individual to individual relationship, it translates. And communicating, I mean, we're how many decades deep into this now? Like you said, Reaganomics really changed the landscape. I mean, we're 40, 50, 60 years into this now. And I think generations have lost touch with the difference between what you're talking about and what the average person is buying at the store.
Yeah, and it's just the collapse of dignity in these production models.
Mm,
I mean, the sense of pride you have when you raise your own animal and someone eats it is such, you know what I mean? That's such a beautiful thing. Whereas now it's like if you're just paid low wage to go into and haul out dead pig bodies, that's so degrading, so mentally taxing for a job. I mean, that's part of my coffee chapter. So my coffee, each Baron's really a way for me to
yeah.
tell a story. And my coffee chapter is about the history of monopoly. And I really want to talk about Melton's Bakery in Iowa just because I think being the child of a small business owner really shaped me there where she just had so much pride. I mean, there's no coffee native to Iowa. My mom, people came to my mom's store because she knew them. You know what I mean? We went to their funerals, all that kind of stuff. Their birthdays, whatever. And these like large entities just don't do that. They just don't care, and the workers don't care, and you can feel it. I mean, I think about that a lot. And the other thing, just to go back to that cult of efficiency, is it's not even making cheap food anymore. I mean, my favorite chart I always show right away when I give a talk is Americans spend more money on food now than most other Western democracies. We're about dollar for dollar for Italy. Anyone that's been to Italy knows food's way better there. And the system is just, that's what I love. I guess what it can be, it's easy to be really dark here, but what I really love about doing this kind of work is everyone seeing it's not working. Like whatever your
Mhm.
politics are, is just, especially even the taste stuff. Like I actually found talking to people is older Americans notice it more than anything because they remember like pork chops used to taste good.
Mhm.
Now they don't. And like the
Mhm.
younger kids just they're used to kind of shit and they don't know what it's like to have like a good product.
I got a little like choked up hearing you talk about your mom's bakery because I feel that about my business. Like the people who shop from us would buy like dryer lint from me if they knew that that would be what it took to support my business and my family because they're so committed and we have such a community. And I think about all the people who just don't view food that way at all. Like I can think of people in my immediate family who are I can hear their voices right now. Oh, but it's important for the food to be as inexpensive as possible. You know, Corinne, what you're doing, it's not going to feed that many people. You're doing maybe 200 hogs a year on a big year. How could you possibly think that this is a real solution? Almost as if the interactions that you're describing at your mom's bakery were a Hallmark movie or something, kind of like mamby pamby, not real, not important. And to get back to what I said earlier, I actually do think that those relationships translate into the food and the health and the overall well-being of people as social animals. So what would you say to the person who says, well, food needs to be cheap, food needs to be as inexpensive as possible, we need these monopolies?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that question, Corinne, because like that's why I just noticed in the back of people's minds when I first started talking about my book that, oh, I'm asking you to pay more for food. So I wanted to show people that chart that like, no, you're actually being gouged um, at the store. I mean, to me, the best example of like, this isn't cheap food is first of all, that table showing that we spend more money on food, but also like McDonald's announced it was filing lawsuit against all the beef packers for being price gouged. And like this past fall, and McDonald's is the largest buyer of beef in the world, and most businesses tend to treat their largest customer the best way possible. So the fact that even McDonald's is saying this is not cheap food and you're gouging me tells you the state of these markets. Um, to your point about, and this is something that it's harder to articulate to people, is like, what food is fuel. What you put into your body really impacts you. I think a lot of the anger too people feel right now is we're eating a lot of junk and that just doesn't sit well with you. And to go back to also to the price is never forget that the system we have now is radical. Like what you're doing is the way we traditionally did hogs for eons. It is radical that one man does 5 million hogs. And the scary thing is the system is incredibly fragile and it's breaking in front of us. Like this whole egg thing right now, that's going to become the norm. I mean, that's a result of this production model. And the last thing I'll say, especially in the pork industry, is we're producing more and more industrial hogs, but our pork consumption is not going up in America. It's basically for export. And so it's for China and Mexico. We have to ask ourselves, is it worth destroying rural communities in America to feed China and Mexico? And I just don't think it's not. So like my hope is to like, I want a bunch of you guys, I mean, that's the future for rural America for me is I don't want you to become a baron. I want a bunch of you.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. I want there to be a myriad of people with different experiences and their families and their um, communities and cultures weaving in on the land, because there's just so much joy and dignity. And sure, it's humbling work, everybody talks about that. But I think sometimes we harp on that instead of the alternative about how deeply gratifying the work can be. And I think it's different to live a life where you're perhaps going through hardship, but it has meaning and purpose and value
Bingo.
versus, yeah, go ahead.
No, I love that because I think I get, there's two questions I always get asked. And one is always, well, people don't want to do this work. And it's like, I don't believe that. Like anyone that knows anyone that runs a restaurant knows they're not living in mansions. Running a small, like a local restaurant, it's a hard business. You're not making that much money, but people do it because they enjoy the quality of the work so much more than working in a box. And like, I really do believe that here with what you're doing is the pride, the dignity, honestly, the set your own day is so much better than like the hollowness of so many corporate jobs anymore.
Yes. And then when you're in a job that doesn't have true meaning to you in a tangible sense, it's so much harder to endure the lousy parts of any career. And we're asking people to do that. I mean, I had someone ask me the other day, like, where they see robots fitting into my business, or where I see robots fitting into my business. And it's not that I couldn't make improvements with like my emails or billing and sales, or some of the logistics stuff that I do in my breeding schedules. I'm sure I can use lots of technological efficiencies to improve that. But the idea that I would replace the human connection with an animal with a robot, I know that this makes me sound like a Luddite, but that's what so many Americans think of when they think of making food cheaper.
That and making it packaged, processed, so it has like an insanely long shelf life. But then you can't look at things in isolation. Like, oh well, this one product, Cheerios, has this extra vitamin added. That's not the same as it holistically in a product. I'm just thinking about that because we buy cream top milk. That's like my go-to milk. The funny thing about writing this book is I realized quickly every commodity is different and they have their own little nuances. On top of it, every production region is differently. And like there's a whole debate in milk between milk and ultra processed milk, like Fairlife. Is that milk? If you take milk, you disassemble it and you reassemble it. Fascinating conversation. But even I have to tell you, in your neck of the woods, what I find so cool are all those old potato barns, which is like something in Iowa I would never know growing up. And you're like, what a beautiful thing of heritage. And it makes sense. And like, that's, we don't want to lose these things. I mean, in Wisconsin, they have the red barns and those things are collapsing in front of us right now too.
Yeah, where I am, there's a really interesting debate because people want to, I'm going to use air quotes, conserve farmland. But what they want to do is conserve hay fields to conserve a view corridor. Where I live is painfully beautiful, and I understand the impulse to want to keep it painfully beautiful. But we're getting, you touched on this earlier, to a point where so much of what we're doing is not actually about human food. So many of the farms around me do not produce food that you could eat or I could eat. My livestock can eat some of it. Others of it is just drenched in things I would never feed to my animals. And then over in the Midwest, of course, we're dealing with like tons and tons of ethanol. Um, how did we get there? How did we get to a point where producing agricultural goods that aren't even sustenance for our own people is the profitable and smart thing to do?
Oh man, that's such a great question. I mean, I think the biggest thing right now is the separation between ownership and farming.
Mm,
What I mean by that is like a lot of my parents cosplay as farmers, but are you really a farmer if you're like, you have a suburban office in Des Moines that looks like a dentist clinic and you have your own
mhm.
spokesperson? Um, they don't care about the land. I can tell that always right away in Iowa. Usually, what happens is grandma and grandpa die, kids move to like Long Beach, they put into a trust, they rent it out. That renter is just barely getting by, so they're trying to make margin each year. So they farm right up to the creek. There's a land, all these land issues that come from it. But here's the thing: that's what the system is designed to do. Like that's like my big focus in my grain chapter is about the Farm Bill, and the Farm Bill is for my grain barons Cargill, the largest private company in America, and the Farm Bill is now designed for Pepsi and no one else. So it's all about making cheap grains because they want to make cheap corn syrup, cheap chips, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't care about the family farmer, and like basically, if you want to grow local healthy produce, you don't get anything in the Farm Bill. But if you want to grow corn, you get tons. And so every year is like a record grain crop, and at some point where these markets are glutted and like in common econ 101, well, you just grow something else, grow hay, do whatever. But instead we come up with these artificial new uses for the surplus. So like
Mm.
ethanol to me is the best example of it. Like ethanol is going to be like the hill I die on because it's like I think ethanol has been the most destructive thing for the Midwest, especially for cattle ranchers, because it's expanded the corn belt. People that rent land for cattle or own land, you just can't compete on price against corn. So a lot of pasture land's been transitioned into corn, and you just like this is the best soil in the world, and you're wasting it in your car. Like it's so dumb. But that's
And
what
it's bad for your car.
it's bad for your car. Like there's so much. Here's the thing: I buy it when I buy it when I'm in Iowa because it's cheaper. They don't have gas tax on it. So like I get why
Mm.
people do it, but like you're right, it's bad for your car, and it's like it's one of those things where it's such a good microcosm of the American food system of like this is just so stupid.
Wow, I have so much to say. And being in pork, we don't feed corn or soy. We're in a place where we grow barley. That's our local grain. And so my pigs eat a lot of barley and they're rotated on pasture and they will eat some meat or some, excuse me, some milk and some eggs from time to time. And I think about how much of that corn that most hogs are eating in the Midwest has already been paid for by the taxpayer. Like how much, when we think about cheap food, we're thinking about the price at the grocery store, but we're not thinking about what's coming out of our taxes. You mentioned the farm bill. I've heard you say before that you're about ready to gut the USDA for parts. And I've been at that place. I've been at that place for such a long time because I fail to see how these programs are making food and life for the American consumer any better. Like if you were going to steel man the farm bill with all of its shenanigans, what would you say?
What do you mean by stale man? Sorry.
I mean, like if you were going to make the best case for it.
Oh, I mean, if I had a 401k and all I cared about was, what I mean, whatever the stock of Pepsi, like that's only justification. Like to me, by like every metric, USDA has failed, and I actually think it's been underappreciated how much they've even failed farmers. Like my favorite stat here is, for every dollar you spend at the store, the American farmer gets the lowest ever recorded in American history. It's like 11 or 12 cents. Whereas like we rewind the clock back to like after Franklin Delano Roosevelt did a bunch of reforms. it was more than 50 cents on the dollar. And just first of all, imagine what rural America would be if more than half the money people spent on food went back to those communities instead of being captured by these oligarchs or these barons. Um, on top of it, I mean, we're paying for it. So we're subsidizing this junk system. We're paying for it too indirectly with our health cost. I mean, it's Iowa. I mean, again, the Iowa stuff it's hard to talk about because it's especially in Iowa, because like, people in Iowa know it's broken, but sometimes when you're barely getting by, you don't really want to add to it. And like Iowa has the second highest cancer right now in America, has an obesity crisis, and it has a water crisis. And it's so clearly tied to this production system. You just see why everyone's angry. And like I don't want to fault any farmer. I mean, a lot of people I know went into confinement because like that's what they were told to do. Um, and on top of it, it's a classic thing you see in business where when these production models change, they flood you got a lot of Wall Street money flew into this space. They made it look really good at first. People switched over production models. And then guess what? They're turning the screws now. And like the thing I didn't expect writing this book was a lot of confinement owners have reached out to me because now they're being basically pushed out as there's been consolidation in that space. So, I mean, like for me personally, also, I should last thing. Sorry, I could rant about the Farm Bill all day, but
Please.
it's picking favorites, and you shouldn't. I mean, to me, the beautiful thing about America is an American grocery store. Is you have so many different cultures and cuisines going on here, and you're like, nowhere else in the world does that really exist. And you know, it's almost like it's capitalism at its best. But right now, it's not a fair playing field. You know, that processed foods, those Oreos are getting way more subsidy than like that locally grown carrot, whatever. Because on top of it, and that's what I just don't like. I don't like picking favorites. And so, in my perfect world, we'll just take the money in the Farm Bill, those like farm entitlement programs, and just make it one big pot of money of stewardship payments, where hey, and let farmers decide what's best for them and their land. Like, hey, if you do cover crops, you get this money. If you do buffer strips, you get this money. If you do pasture, this money. But let farmers decide. It's almost like a toolkit where you guys do farm. It's one of those areas I want to explore more. It's like one of my bucket list items when this book slows down. First of all, it's fucking beautiful. Sorry, it's really beautiful. One of my habits I got into post COVID is I love driving America's scenic highways. I just do 2-lane roads. I rode Atlas because I'm a big believer in you have to see America to understand America, and it's figuring that out. But I also don't want to engage in a one size fits all. I just it doesn't make sense. Like you're going to eat more pork in certain parts of America. You're going to eat more seafood in other parts. Let these cuisines reflect the environment that, people live in.
I love everything that you just said. And if you ever make it out here and explore, you're welcome to come to Late Bloomer Ranch. We'd love to see you here. But you've reminded me of a question I get all the time, which is, Corinne, if your pork is so pure and it doesn't have this and it doesn't have that and it's raised properly and minimally, why is it 3 times as expensive as a pork chop at our local supermarket, which has pretty much every foreign substance known to man pumped into it? What would you say to that person? How would you explain that miraculous phenomenon?
Because you're getting no subsidy and the other one gets a ton of subsidy. So you're not playing on a level playing field. I'm fortunate enough where we have the income where we can buy that. My goal is I want your pork chop to be the back, because that used to be the norm. I want to get back to that. So my big goal is actually using schools to drive this supply system change. I think it's good politics, first of all. Like, who doesn't want, every all beef served in, let's say, Kansas coming from Kansas cattle ranchers instead of like the Brazilian rainforest? Schools buy a lot and they buy a lot consistently. You're keeping your money locally. And even the notion of cooking food, I mean, going back to dignity of work, it's one thing to be paid hourly and you just cook frozen square pizza. It's another thing to like, hey, we have a bumper crop of this, let's cook some of this. How do we experiment? Also, the students are learning about this over here. So how do we incorporate that? Like, first of all, that makes it fun. And I should also say a lot of schools are already doing this, but they're also doing this, they're running uphill. And so like, how do we help them and how do we expand on that? Because it's also, I think people crave hope right now. Like hope, but also like people doing, like Americans doing good things to each other. And what a great example of that.
It's so true. And our children really need it because they're sicker than ever.
Yeah, I mean, like Lunchables for our kids in schools, like come on, like that's so. We're getting to the point where it's so cartoonish.
Yeah, you mentioned bird flu earlier, And I also wanted to ask you, I think they kind of have a similar, I intuit that you're going to go on a similar thread with both of them. So I'll ask you two questions together. You can answer them separately or in the same vein. But we have this bird flu explosion. And at the same time, I'm reading about some of these child labor lawsuits with JBS and Purdue and some of these other giant meat packers that are using children to work dangerous jobs in their giant concrete, behemoth plants. How do we get out of this? Like, what do we actually do? Because if you talk to Brooke Rollins, the answer is to like go deeper into the spiral, right? It's just to like and she's the head of the USDA right now.
Let
The
me
answer
just
is just to go further. But what would you suggest to get us out of these cyclones of terror?
well, let me just start with the premise. And I realized this the other day. There's never been a good Secretary of Agriculture in my lifetime. Like that's a bipartisan statement right there. I mean, I have no hope for her. I'd rather be proven otherwise. But her career has been in service of oligarchs until I see action by USDA. And also this is in the weeds, but this is why it's really important. Is I always tell people join farm groups, food groups, whatever, because you need staff to pay attention to this stuff. But when you appoint a president, you're getting thousands of appointees, and like the under level appointees in USDA are not good right now, especially in the meat industry. It's someone from the last go around who's just basically pro consolidation. But your question about the child labor stuff is, this is a weird analogy, but I've been thinking of it like a garden. Like you got to prune a garden, or else an invasive species takes over. And I compare this to like regulations, or what I call guardrails. You need to establish rules of the road. Like you can't employ children. What a radical concept. Because here's the thing: once one person does it and gets away with it, and they get slapped on the wrist, that's just the cost of doing business. And you allow a race to the bottom where if other actors don't engage that way, you can't compete on price against that production model. And so, I mean, that's usually what I tell my libertarian friends is step one is always trust busting for me. These markets are so consolidated is they'll first of all, they'll put up barriers to stop anyone new from, getting into these markets. Classic thing you hear from small meat packers is just how many barriers they face. And that's honestly, it's like, that's because of the stranglehold the big packers have over USDA. And second is, with that much economic power, they're able to capture the political system. So by doing some Teddy Roosevelt trust busting, you reduce that power and that capture they have over USDA. So you can allow these small regional packers to thrive, innovate, do whatever, and establish those rules where you can't use child labor. You just got to set boundaries. Here's the thing: markets change, so these boundaries should change, but you can't be naive to them. Like if you don't have boundaries, you have a race to the bottom, and that's how you get middle schoolers working in the slaughterhouses now. And on top of it, I think executives should go to jail for this stuff, or at least until the people in the boardroom feel these consequences, they'll just keep doing that. I mean, if there's any lesson we learned from the Great Recession is bankers didn't go to jail, and people get mad,
Yeah.
and like that is actions need consequences, and I'm so sick of blaming on the low level person. You got to go to the head honcho.
I was listening to you talk about the ways that the big meat packers, for instance, will edge other people out. And that's kind of what I saw with this bird flu discussion, because I just feel that in so many ways, we use a small family run meat packer, and I can't say enough good things about them. And they've been around for long enough that they do our bacon with just salt, sugar, brown sugar, and liquid smoke. If you apply today with a brand new business with that recipe, it will likely be denied. And I think, when we're doing, correct me if I'm wrong, but from where I sit, there's this sort of snake eating its own tail where we have these mega, mega, mega industrial systems like with eggs. They create pestilence and disease. Then we try and medicate the pestilence and disease. It doesn't go away. Then we raise the bar for the minimum standard that each farm has to meet in terms of these, cleanliness, air quotes, and safe, air quotes, standards, when really none of those, or a fraction of those rather, would be necessary in open air systems, smaller family farms, maybe one person with a couple thousand hens instead of one person with a million hens laying eggs in their hen house. what are you seeing in terms of the ways, like the actual mechanisms that these monopolies are using to push out smaller producers?
I mean, I think you nailed it right there. I mean, they'll put up boundaries. They'll first of all they'll get priority in these crises. They will design the systems to kind of lock you out. And here's the thing: you don't really realize it. It happens slowly. It happens here. They do it incrementally. But the whole time you were telling that, I kept going back to is the beauty of a family farm. It's almost like a diversified retirement portfolio. Is in case one market craters, you still have other things. And what's happened now is the system's pushing people to do one or two things, and so it makes them so fragile. Which is like you would never put your retirement in one stock, but essentially we force farmers to do that. And we're seeing that now in bird flu, where it used to be you grow your own grain to feed your own animals. Now those are separate. You know, you grow grain, you sell it to my grain baron, who sells it to the hog confinement owner. And so if you just do eggs right now, all of a sudden, this disease happens. You're so fragile. I mean, the other good example is COVID with the hog industry. We couldn't do the slaughterhouses for a little bit because of the disease outbreak. And so it's just like a normal family farm. You just let the pig, let them be on pasture for a little bit longer. But these systems started breaking because they don't have that flexibility. And it's fragile, it's dumb. And then also, here's the thing, in the big scheme of things, it's more expensive because then you have to spend these massive amounts of money doing all this. You have to kill a bunch of animals. It's just not, it's short-termism, Excel thinking is what I kind of call it. Anyone that's been in these spaces and knows, you quickly realize that it's like, it's costing you more long-term, so you wouldn't do it. But someone who's, quote, farming from a cubicle in downtown Chicago doesn't think that way. And they also don't know these industries. They don't know the nuances of them. That's what to me is really concerning here. It's just, this is an expensive, fragile system.
Right. And they're so clever about it because they can get so many of their costs written off by the USDA, by crop insurance, by these price supports. I mean, can you explain to the listener? Because I have so many, obviously, someone listening to this podcast is at least mildly interested in family farming and holistic animal management, etc. But I still get people who I know and love and trust and I'm pretty close with who will say, well, look, this carton of eggs at the supermarket is labeled local, thinking that means something. And I just think that a lot of these costs are not being borne out. Like, who's carrying the burden, and
Yeah.
what is that mechanism? Because it really gets to this concept in your book that these are almost like cartels. Like, they're almost like mobs that I believe you said are willing to go to any lengths to accomplish their goal of pushing anyone else out, even if that means using the government.
Yes. The Slaughter Marion chapter is one that shocked me the most. I feel like I know the meat industry pretty well, and I didn't even know the full story because the news came out in 2020, right before the election, so it just got lost. But like, they pled guilty to bribing over 1,800 politicians, and I'm not talking like campaign bribes. I'm like, they gave them and had an apartment to a politician to basically get cheap money from the Brazilian government to go on a massive acquisition spree. First of all, if you buy a merger through illegal means, you shouldn't be able to keep the purchase. Let's start there. What a radical thing. Um, but on top of it, like, what came out in the news is Secretary Vilsack under President Biden was still giving USDA contracts and subsidies to JBS, which at some point, to me, when I read that chapter, they're just a child that's never been disciplined. And so they keep pushing the envelope, and that one I gotta be careful with my words because of lawsuits, but like, they would allegedly bribe meat inspectors, allegedly use child labor, allegedly do X, Y, and Z. And it's just like, well, that's because they haven't faced consequences. They're going to keep being bad. To your point, though, on labeling, I mean, that's something there's all these little things when you publish a book, like, I should have done that, should have done this. What I should say, I haven't told anyone this. I almost did Cal-Maine as my egg baron in the book. It's the big egg producer right now in America. They have like a 20% market share. It just didn't pan out. But I wanted to talk about labeling. I mean, I personally know most labels don't mean anything in the food unless I'm buying from the farmer or whatever. That's what I can trust. These corporate entities have hollowed out these labels. So you think you're buying into something. Like, these big entities are essentially exploiting the good feelings they have towards you to their benefit. So like, one little example too is this is one that I always remember is I was in DC. I worked in DC at one point, and my boss took me out for like a nice lunch. And on the restaurant, the menus say, well, this beef is from XYZ farm. said Cedar River Farms, and I'm from Cedar Rapids. I was like, oh, this is cool. Let me buy. I never heard of those local farms. Let me try, check it out when I get home. Googled it, and it's a fake local farm. It's actually based in Greenlee, Colorado, and you're like, oh, this is classic. I mean, I'm paying a premium because I think I'm buying your product when it's really just them selling me, generic feedlot beef. It's hard. The labeling stuff is hard to talk about because, like, I personally, not a lot of consumers know that the labels don't mean something. So I don't want to break the labels. I don't want to tell everyone, well, don't trust organics. I don't trust organics if on the back of the packaging it says it's from another country, because I don't trust Turkey to uphold its organic standards. That said, I had a farm. I mean, what I like about doing these talks and talking with people is I mean, I'll never forget this. I had a cattle rancher and I would tell me, like, you're right, but please don't break. Like, let's try to save the label. Like, let's not tell the public fully about the rot of these labels, because these labels still mean something to them. Let's fix them, because it's really hard to break the label and then fix it. So, like, that's like, again, part of my anger with Vilsack is, like, when beef says made in the USA, it should be made in the USA. Like, why is this taking forever? Why is this a fight? This should be done in day one. I don't give me so much of DC right now is like, they blame someone else. It's always, oh, this is too complicated. You're like, I'm sorry, it's just a label. You're not talking AI. You're not talking whatever. It's a label. Make these things mean something. So sorry, that's a little bit of a tangent, but I'm really glad you asked, because the labels, there's so much of illusion. There's so much deceit going on right now. And, like, I think companies should really be I think more aggressive actions by the government should be done to, like, really rein in this exploitation by companies, because they're doing it off the backs of people doing it right, and the people doing it right don't get the benefit of it.
I'm really happy that you went on that tangent. This is one of my favorite topics, and people often ask me, well, what about this certification, or what about that certification? And I think the tragedy is that the certifications are always started with people who are really intending to do it right, and then they get watered down, and it always comes back to the same topic of, well, price, right? Like, oh, I can't have adults who need health insurance working in my meat packing barn, because then I would have to raise the price. Or I can't have, my strawberries grown in real soil to be certified organic, because that would just raise the price, or whatever. And I find it really interesting that these labels, they always talk about kind of aspirations, like all natural pork from Smithfield, but they don't have to disclose any of the negative attributes. Like, what if they had to list all of the various pharmaceutical products that went into that all natural pork at any point of its lifespan? That would be an entirely different label. And I just think, correct me if I'm wrong, but when people ask me this, I just say, you have to know the person who's raising it. It's really the only way.
Right now, yes, I would say. What I go back to, the thing I always push back, the classic thing you hear from some people is, well, we need to educate the consumer more. I hate the phrase educate more, because, like, for example, they put calories on menus. No one changes. You know what I mean? If I want ranch with my fries, I'm going to get ranch. In the day, most of us are working 9 to 5 job. You're barely getting by, whatever. You're dealing with kids. People buying food at the grocery store should know there's a base level here. You know what I mean? Like, there's not crap in my food. And the failure here is on public servants to be public servants. They're not doing their job. You should know when you buy pork, it's American made. It was made with dignity. It was made, you know what I mean? Like, people, when they bought bacon 40 years ago, knew that. Any grocery store in America, they knew there was that standard, and that's gone. And, like, so right now, yes, to anyone, is you got to buy from the farmer, because given the system, that's the only way you can really know. But, moving down the road, I want to get to a point where, it doesn't have to be on them. They should know that when they buy a product anywhere, regardless in this country, there's a set level, there's a base level standard.
Yeah, it's targeted ads are so funny. I got a targeted ad the other day. Idaho farmers are being pushed by these rampant attacks on glyphosate, and food costs are going to go up if you don't sign this petition to protect the farmer. And I just kept thinking, like, who's protecting the farmer from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma? Who's, like, I mean, it's just so wild how deeply entrenched this stuff is. And it makes me, I'm naturally an optimist, but I really want to ask you, like, how do we back our way out of this? Because this, in my mind, started with corn and soy subsidies, then got, ballooned by the death of trust busting and Reaganomics, et cetera. And then kind of like all hell broke loose in COVID, like you said. And now we're at this point where everyone's frustrated. People are sick. That's why people are buying the cute label at the grocery store that says like local eggs from a mega egg farm. How do we fix this like in a practical way?
So I'm glad you asked, because that was a big goal at the end of my book. Is there's nothing worse than when you read a book that's everything's broken, 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 and they don't actually lay out concrete solutions. Silver linings. Writing a book like this is you realize most people are doing it right. It's just a greed of a few holding us back. Most people are good people. The second is these fork in the road moments are coming. Like ethanol is going to die. Cars are moving to hybrids, EVs, whatever. Right now, to me, it's like watching Wile E. Coyote run off a cliff. So we got to start thinking, because first of all, ethanol is now the largest use of corn now in the Midwest. It's like 48, 50% of the corn crop. Just imagine if every car right now got twice, the mileage. You cut that market in half. What are you going to do with that much corn land? You got to start thinking now, because like you don't build up these supply chains overnight. That's going to have a come to Jesus moment. And the other one too is like, I'm just so personally convinced some smart politician will come along and do a Teddy Roosevelt thing here, because people are being gouged by the meat stuff. You see how bipartisan it is right now, where you have Elizabeth Warren working with Josh Hawley. You had Mike Lee working with Cory Booker on checkoff reform. The politics of this stuff is really weird and really bipartisan. And some canny politician will figure it out. And the system just adds to the fragility of it all. The egg stuff right now will continue. It will only get worse. Especially, I'm more concerned with hogs. I mean, China has these 10-story massive hog facilities, and you're just asking for a disease outbreak. I mean, you're playing Russian roulette. And for me personally, I know those moments are going to come. These markets are going to break. So I want to spend my time being like, what should the systems be? And like, I think neither party right now is articulating a positive vision. There's only so many cows on pasture one farmer can look after. I want to get back to that. So that's kind of where my head is articulating that. And because I also just think like, who isn't happy after a good meal? And I think like just going to this system help take the temperature down. Like your hometown actually has some of my favorite food on the East Coast. There's just like a lot of pride in Baltimore. Like I love pie. And there's like a pie store I love in Baltimore. And it's like they make 50 kinds of pie, they innovate, and like it's local people doing local things. That's where the true innovation comes from, and the coolest things.
Yeah, and I just hope that we get there fast enough that we aren't having some of these top-down agricultural reforms from, things like taxing methane or giving whatever that drug is to cows to reduce their methane in their manure, or having to register all livestock, et cetera. And I think that there is a streak in urban American life that thinks that that's the way to like control these problems, is by new technological solutions that would work for a hog barn with 5 million hogs in it, or whatever, however many he's doing a year, your hog baron, or that my farm with 13 sows would use. And I just want to believe in a future where it's more bottom up and it's more from the family farm initiating these changes based on raising animals on the landscape, or raising vegetables in soil, or like actually farming food products for people to eat.
And never forget that the bottom up, that's the beauty of America, and that's always where it comes from. I mean, the first anti-monopoly laws in the world were bottom up. It was farmers against grain elevators in Iowa. So Iowa was the first state in the world, or first government to create anti-monopoly laws. I say all this because I really do believe in my core DC is the last to know. You got to start locally. You got to have these proof of concepts. I mean, it's not easy. It's not hard. But like right now, there's a lot, build on these schools doing it right. I mean, that's why I tell anyone, if you like buying good local meat, the best thing you can do for that farmer you like is help them get a contract with local school or college. It really matters when you send that email to a food director being like, hey, first of all, the food director, they're doing a ton. But if you sit there and say, well, let me help you do this, let's figure this out, that's really cool. And then, you start doing this, and guess what? Start bragging about it. Let local politicians know, hey, we're trying to buy local beef, but we're hitting this regulatory barrier. Can you help us fix this law? And then you have to document it, so then you can let other communities know that want to do it. And then, guess what? Politicians will start showing up. They'll get pictures. That's how these things happen. And you see that in American history. Like, people talk about the New Deal. A lot of the New Deal actually came out of Wisconsin. It was, people, researchers, legislators, farmers, workers working together to essentially come up with like unemployment insurance, that kind of stuff. For a country of 300 million, you can't do, you know what I mean? You can't just do something overnight the snap of fingers. So how do we do that? And also, like, I don't know. I think that the proof of concept is something my mentor always told me, and I really like that idea.
Who, on that note, who do you see doing it right, or where are glimmers of hope that you've witnessed?
Oh man, there's so many. I mean, that's why I like doing. So I do a lot of speaking like hotels by the interstates right now, and I call that, my joke is I call it the rubber chicken circuit.
It's cute.
I love it because you get the best. It's the best gossip. The two ones that come to my mind were, I was speaking at literally a Wisconsin water park hotel in December, and my friend Sarah Lloyd was telling me, Wisconsin has this new program that no one really knows about, where historically Native American tribes, they would just dump junk surplus food on them. What they did instead is they created this new pilot program, and they've been slowly building it up, where they buy farm food from native farmers to give to native people, wild rice, bison, whatever. What a cool thing! It helps maintain their culture. You're buying from local farmers, all that kind of good stuff. And it was like, oh, this is such a cool example of tribal communities are much stronger in certain states than other states. No one in DC is talking about that program, but these people have been working on it. I think 5 years is what I know about, figuring out the kinks, working it up. Because also, like, anyone who farms, this stuff takes a while. You got to know that there's a commitment there, that you can build up, you can make those investments, and that other people can enter that market. Like, oh, okay, there's actually money to be made here if I do bison. Let's pivot. Let's make this capital investment. But then now you got to brag about it. That's what I tell them. And then the other example is, there's a school district called Storm Lake, Iowa. It's a slaughterhouse town. It's turkey and pork who are Tysons, and there's a lot of immigrants there for the packing plant, and a lot of the immigrants actually farm on the side, like just small plots where they can do like crops from their home. But the school's done a really good job of incorporating that into the cafeteria, so that way the kids not from those cultures can be like, hey, we're going to learn about lemongrass today. So you're buying from local farmers, you're teaching the other kids about it. I mean, that's beautiful. And like, also, those are the stories people want to read in the newspaper. I love reading them. Dolores Cullen is the reporter up there, and she writes a lot about it. And it's, I don't know, it's that kind of stuff. But here's the thing, there's tons of this. I can't say this enough. There's a lot of, and I see them on Instagram or like Twitter where, someone does local food. I just want to make it easier, because it's really, really, really hard to not serve our children frozen square pizza.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Austin, this has been so informative, and I feel like I could talk to you forever about this, because there's so much to cover, and your book is so informational, and it's just action packed for the 6 hours, almost 7 hours of audio content. It's like a course in ag policy.
I think so. I mean, my goal was, I just feel like smartphones have changed the way we read. So I just want to get to the point. And yeah. I'm also like really into audibles. I mean, that's like a weird since COVID is I do a lot of audible when I do my long drives. That's usually what I'm doing.
Yeah, exactly. Me too. And when I'm out doing chores, or I'm, with my baby or something, I'll throw an audiobook on, and yours just flew by, and it's super interesting. And I don't think it's pessimistic. So everybody listening, please go check out Austin's book, Barons. And do you have any recommendations for people who are listening who feel fired up about wanting to like change food in their local economy? Like, what would you say to them to close?
Focus on local. Focus on the schools and colleges. Help your favorite farmers at the farmers market, wherever, get those contracts, and also pressure the schools. And I say this is, I went to a small school in Iowa for college, and one of the most famous produce farms in Iowa was right next to it, and they went broke. And there's no reason why a college with that endowment wasn't buying their produce from literally across the street instead of buying it from like, Mexico, where it's picked by children. Also, by the way, that's not good produce. I'm so used to Gimlet carrots in the store. They have no taste. And I started buying my carrots at the farmer's market a few months ago, and like, it's so much better. I mean, that's the thing is, so much of these things is we turn away from these products. People are turning away from dairy. And it's like, you don't know what good dairy used to be. So I say all this is like, you got to pressure these schools. You got to shame them, because it's like, they should help drive this, especially some of these schools with the endowments they have, these colleges. they should be spending their money locally. This is part of their charity of not paying taxes locally. Is they should be doing this kind of work and helping to drive, because it helps drive down the cost structure for everyone else with those large contracts.
So true. Thank you so much. Where can people find you?
Yeah, my socials and my website are Austin Frerick, Frerick.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on.